Shankar is an editor and writer with Knowledge at Wharton, the Business Journal of Wharton School. And previously, he was a former editor of the Economic Times. And he's also the co-founder of BBLF, for those who still don't know. But I think after all these years of attending us, I'm sure you know that. So Shankar, I'm just going to keep that quick and let you go ahead with introducing Mukul and Mauro. Thanks.
Thank you, Pooja, and thank you, Mauro and Mukul, for making time for this. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is, Mukul knows Mauro for much longer than I have known him. So Mukul is going to introduce Mauro to you. He'll do a better job than me. But I want to introduce Mukul to you. Mukul is a friend, and he's been a boss for many, many years, more than 2 decades for me. He's also been one of my biggest mentors. He's one of the senior most of business editors, I would say, globally. He's also widely respected. He has more than 40 years of experience as a writer and an editor. And he has many accomplishments. And the one that stands out is that 22 years ago, he pioneered online business publishing when he founded Knowledge at Wharton, the business journal of the Wharton School at UPenn. Now, he grew Knowledge at Wharton to great success with many international and multilingual editions as its editor-in-chief and executive director. And he retired recently. And after his retirement, he was a senior fellow with the Wharton Customer Analytics and Artificial Intelligence for Business. He has won many awards for investigative journalism. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Time Magazine, Philadelphia Inquirer, and many other publications. He's also written or co-authored 4 books. And most recently, he edited a book called Transformation in Times of Crisis by Nitin Rakesh and Jerry Wind. So I'm going to pass the mic to Mukul. Mukul, thank you for joining us and for hosting this session.
Shankar, thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction. You're very kind to give me credit for Knowledge at Wharton. The truth is that I had a relatively small part. I think if Knowledge at Wharton grew to the size and impact it did, the credit goes to professors like Mauro Guillen and other faculty at Wharton whose research we had the privilege to share, and also to the Knowledge at Wharton team, including you, with whom it was such a joy to work. But
I want to just point viewers' attention to one thing on your wall, that clock of yours, and that really tells. Mukul's been a very, very hard worker. So the team presented him a clock with 13 hours, as you can see. Anyway, Mukul, carry it.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't resist that.
Mauro, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the Bangalore BizList Festival. I'm so happy to be here with you. And I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to you for your time, to the entire team joining, who has organized the conference, and to everyone who has joined us today to learn from you. So let me start by introducing everyone who is here to Professor Mauro Guillen. He is a prominent expert, award-winning scholar and teacher. And after a distinguished career at Wharton, at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and he was the Anthony L. Davis Director of the Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies from 2007 to 2019. He led its first ever fundraising campaign and launched a new curriculum emphasizing hands-on learning experiences. And he has long been a champion of diversity. In his official bio, you will see a number of awards and scholarship that he has won. But I'd like to say something that you won't read in his bio, which is that during the years that we were building Knowledge at Wharton, Mauro was always one of the biggest champions of sharing knowledge with everyone who wanted to learn, not only with his own research, but throughout the school. And the two initiatives that that come to mind are the Knowledge at Wharton High School edition, which Mauro played a very active role in helping us launch. And also when Cuba opened up, joining in creating the Cuba Opportunity Summit. So he has just been an amazing, scholar and teacher. And I'm so happy to be speaking with him today and sharing his insights with all of you. He's also a best-selling author, including the recently published 2030, How Today's Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. And that's the book we are going to speak about today. Before I start my first question for Mauro, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you can please add your questions to the chat feature, we'll try and get to as many as we can. So again, many thanks to you all. So Mauro, your book is titled 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. As I was reading it, I was reminded of the old Danish saying that it is hazardous to make predictions, especially about the future. What inspired you to undertake this hazardous task of writing a book about trends that will reshape the future of everything? What need were you trying to address?
Well, first of all, Mukul, thank you so much for inviting me. I should say I've visited very few places in India, but Bangalore is one of them. And I'm very, very happy to join this event from my office in Cambridge in the UK. And needless to say, it's such a pleasure to be able to share the stage, the virtual stage, with you. So to your question, look, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was sensing that people were a little bit lost. There were already very significant signs that things were changing in the world, changing in a way that was very different from the kinds of changes that, for example, people like you or I had experienced in our childhood, or as we were growing up, or when we took our first job. These were major transformations. And I thought about what might be the best way to help people make sense out of those transformations. And I thought that perhaps writing a book that would be sort of a roadmap to those transformations, I think would be not only intellectually challenging for me, so something that I would enjoy doing, but also something that I was hoping would be helpful, would be useful to people as they try to navigate this maze of change that we're going through in the world. So that was essentially the motivation. I thought that people were asking questions about the future. And you're right. I mean, predicting the future is not easy, but that shouldn't deter us from considering what the future might bring. And of course, it all depends, I think, on what kind of a time horizon you adopt. And in my case, I decided to be relatively careful, cautious, and just think about the next 10 years, which I think is perfectly doable if you are willing to accept certain assumptions. So that's essentially the reason why I wrote the book as a roadmap.
Well, that's that. A 10-year horizon is certainly major trends, demographic trends, social trends, economic, etc. But one of the biggest collisions we of the decade change because of the global pandemic, especially since it's not clear that it is behind us. I mean, it may still be going on, right?
Absolutely. And, I did most of the research for the book and most of the writing before the pandemic, but I was able to make changes in the manuscript here and there, because if you remember, the book came out after 6 or 7 months into the pandemic, meaning in August of 2020. But I think it's really, really important to realize that the COVID-19 pandemic is a kind of crisis that, instead of derailing pre-existing trends, in terms of slowing, instead of slowing things down, what it does is accelerate the changes that were already going on. And I'm sure, we can discuss some specific examples of this in the course of this conversation, but I want people to think about how many pre-existing trends have become accelerated by the pandemic. Think about the adoption of technology. Think about social inequality. Think about the rise of emerging markets and so on. And if you think carefully about some of the, big trends that were going on before the pandemic, I think for the most part, you will realize that there has been an acceleration, that the future that I described for the year 2030 is actually arriving much faster. And look, my only regret about this book, Mukul, is that instead of having 2030 as the title, perhaps the title now should be 2028. Because once again, the future that the book discusses is now arriving much faster.
Or maybe even 2025. You're quite right. Things that are likely to happen in years have been happening in months or weeks. So why don't we take one of the trends you mentioned, which is the emergence of the emerging markets. One of the things that I found really fascinating about your book is that you write that for every baby born nowadays in the developed countries, more than 9 are being born in the emerging markets and the developing world. Now, could we speak a little bit about why is this happening and what are the implications for countries like India, which, as you say, is on track to become the #1 region in terms of the population size? Do you see this trend as a population time bomb, or is it a demographic dividend? How should people think about it?
So I think when people are considering demographic shifts, they tend to go to the extremes. So either it's going to be an unmitigated disaster, right? Because essentially either you're going to have, according to these people, too large a population, or the growth is going to be so fast that you're not going to be able to adjust on time. Or there is the other extreme where people always see a demographic dividend, right? And I think the reality, at least over the next 10 years or so, is going to be more of a mixed bag. So there will be challenges. I think the biggest one, quite frankly, is population aging. Yeah. So as I say in the book, the problem is no longer a population time bomb in the world. The problem is more that we're going through a major transformation and that we're seeing both in rich and poor countries that the population is aging very, very quickly. Now, having said that, the speed at which that change is taking place is very different depending on the part of the world. And so we're going to see quite a bit of population growth in some parts of the world, like Sub-Saharan Africa. But we're going to see a shrinkage of the population in other parts of the world, like Japan, like China, parts of Europe, and so on. So I think, first of all, it's very difficult to generalize to the entire planet. Right. And then secondly, I think we need to be a little bit more balanced in terms of trying to understand the implications, because, for example, population aging may strike most people as a challenge or even a threat. But I think there's also unique opportunities for redefining how we live our lives, for rethinking retirement, for ensuring that we, as a society and as an economy, that we take advantage of the skills and the experience that people above a certain age have, as opposed to, asking them to leave the labor force. So I think in every change or every big transformation, there are positive things and there are negative things. And I think it's really important to be analytical about them.
Sure. Well, let's dig a little deeper into the aspect of the aging population, which I really found interesting because we hear so much chatter about the millennials. But as you point out in the book, one of the really important trend is about senior citizens and the fact that people who are aged more than 60 own more than half the net worth globally. And in the US, the number is even higher, around 80%. How will this change the way the world views retirement? One of the expressions I've heard recently is the silver tsunami. which at a time when grandparents are becoming the most productive people on the planet. Can you talk a little bit about what opportunities this creates for companies to tailor products and services for the gray market? Is gray the new black? This is an important question for people whose hair color is like mine.
Well, look, as you said, if we think about the consumer market in terms of age groups, for the longest time, right, more than 150 years, companies and brands have been focusing on people in their 30s, people in their 40s, because those were the segments of the market with the highest purchasing power. So now what we're seeing increasingly is that 25, 30, 35% of the population is above the age of 60. As you know, this process started in Japan, followed by China, Europe, United States, Latin America, more or less in that order. But now what we're seeing is that not only we have more people above the age of 60, but also that those people have purchasing power. So much so that my prediction in the book is that by the year 2030, perhaps a little bit earlier, the largest segment of the market in terms of purchasing power will be the population. About consumption, about what is it that the consumer is looking for, will need to be revised, because obviously there are differences in terms of what is it that people like at different like to buy at different points in their lives. And once again, if you have the segment of the market above the age of 60 as the most important one, then you're going to have to change the way you approach the market. Or otherwise, companies that fail to do that are going to fall behind. They're not going to be able to grow as much.
Can you give an example of a product or service that has been specifically tailored to this? I mean, I remember you mentioned a seal that was developed in Japan, a robotic seal.
Yeah, so there's something really important going on in the world, which is that we were assuming that some of the newest technologies would be primarily used by millennials, by relatively young people. And I think there are several examples in this category. One of them, I think, is the gig economy. I thought that most of the users of gig work platforms would be relatively young people. But I was wrong. I think what we're going to see is that gradually more and more people in their 50s, 60s, 70s are going to be going to those platforms to make a little bit of money while they preserve their flexibility during at that stage in their lives. And they're going to be doing that because maybe their pension fund is not big enough, or because they want to do something useful, and making a little bit of money on the side is also always a good idea. But the other big example is the one that you mentioned, which is robotics. So I think we are going to witness a huge boom in home robotics, but specifically home robotics for people who have limited functionality. And why is this going to be important? For two reasons. One is that we don't have, or we won't have in the future, enough young people to attend to the needs of people in their 70s, 80s, 90s who prefer to stay at home. That's number one. And number two is that the technology is getting so much better, right? Robotics with AI and so on and so forth. So in Japan, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, because Japan, once again, is the country in the world that has aged the most. Then what we're seeing is a flurry of innovation when it comes to robotics in the home. And you referred to the Robotic Seal, which is already a reality. This is a Japanese company. These seals sell for $3,500. And they are used in nursing homes as a form of therapy for people who are suffering from dementia or from Alzheimer's. So the Robotic Seal, you can pet it, it gives you company, and it won't go away. You see, a real dog or cat will go away after 5 minutes. But what we're seeing in these nursing homes is that people who are suffering from these mental conditions, they interact with these seals for hours, and they actually see an improvement in their health well-being. So much so that in some parts of the world, for example, in Denmark, all of the nursing homes in the country have at least one of these robotic seals made in Japan. So once again, Mukul, I think we're going to see an explosion in terms of the innovations and new applications of robotics for the home.
Thank you. That's what I love about your book, is that it's full of these examples that are very unusual and very relatable, because the seal especially is so good for even elderly people with dementia. So, but let me come back to one more demographic related issue, and that concerns immigration. So immigration has become a real hot button, political hot button all over the world, whether it's about immigrants from Afghanistan or Haiti, or even H-1B applicants to the US from countries like India or China or Russia. Now, is immigrant bashing based on economic reality? Do immigrants steal jobs, or do they create jobs? Are they a threat or an opportunity? How do you see this trend evolving?
So I think immigration is, as you know, a fact of life. So we do have a relatively small proportion of the world's population, no more than 2 or 3%, moving across national boundaries. So they're international migrants. Many of them are looking for better economic opportunities. Some of them are escaping from political conflict or violence or war. I think increasingly we're going to see more of these people movements due to climate change, so the so-called climate refugees. But I think immigration, as the cases of the United States, of Canada, Australia, I would say also Israel, demonstrate, can be turned into a dynamic factor. So what turns out not to be true is that immigrants take jobs away from the locals. This just is normally not the case. And the reason is very simple, which is that most immigrants come in with either very sophisticated skills because they have advanced degrees in sciences or in medicine, or they have no skills and no education. And so they fill in gaps in economies such as the American economy or some of the European economies without really competing for jobs with locals. So that is a myth, right? That all immigrants are essentially coming and stealing jobs away. But the other important thing here, I think, Mukul, is, so how do you handle this? Because obviously, for certain countries that have long borders with certain parts of the world that tend to be sources of immigration, for example, the United States with its southern border, or some European countries, it's actually impossible for them to have an open door policy. On the other hand, to completely close the doors to immigration would make it very hard to take advantage of the benefits. So I think some kind of a happy medium has to be found in these debates. And look, the benefits from immigration are just really, really important. I mean, one is, once again, to bring in people whose skills are needed, and there's not enough of locals with those skills. Second benefit is that normally you're rebalancing the age structure of the population. So in other words, it's a way of addressing the problem of population aging in terms of, for example, the viability of the pension system, because most immigrants are in their 30s and their 40s, and therefore they are of working age. And so what we see in one country after another is that when there is immigration, that immigrants tend to work and therefore pay social security taxes, and thus contribute to the long-term viability of the pension system. And then the third benefit, entrepreneurship. As you know, immigrants tend to be more entrepreneurial than the rest of the population. And the very act of migration is an act of entrepreneurship. But look, in the United States, something very simple, about a third of all of the companies that went public in the Silicon Valley over the last 30 years, about a third of them were either founded or co-founded by an immigrant. So you name the companies, the most famous ones are Google and Tesla, I guess, but there's so many of them. So I think that having a well-balanced, well-structured immigration policy can be a huge boon to the economy and also to the society.
Thank you, Mauro. And before we go further, I just wanted to remind everyone, we've also already started getting a couple of questions, but if there are more people who would like to ask questions and join the conversation, please type them in the chat box and send them our way, and we'll talk about them soon.
Mukul, in the same breath, sorry, you have another 15 minutes, so maybe you could just plan it accordingly, just sensitizing you.
Oh, okay, great.
For the session to close, I mean.
Okay, well, thank you for letting me know. So I have, there was a chapter that I found really fascinating called Keeping Up with the Sings and the Wangs. And you write about the Tata Nano, describing it as one of the worst corporate blunders of all time. And you contrast that with the experience of Weber Stephen, which uncovered a hot market for barbecue grills in India. What do these examples reveal about how the old and new middle classes in the emerging markets will reshape the future of consumption over the next decade?
Well, I think those two examples, one from the automobile industry and the other one from durable consumer goods such as barbecue grills, what I think they demonstrate is that companies make mistakes, and that it's really, really important to understand the cultural values and the preferences of consumers. And I think those two examples that I used in the book are actually really important, because here what we see is the largest company in India actually making a mistake, but at the same time, an American company that really didn't have any understanding of the Indian market, but they did their homework. They did market research. They tried to look for a way to make their product relevant to the Indian consumer, and they succeeded big time. So I think the lesson is, whether you're a large company or a small company, whether you already think that you know about the market or not, you need to do your homework. You need to do the analysis. You need to go through all of the, different kinds of tests or filters before you decide to launch a product in a particular market. So for me, those are the lessons. We all need good fortune, but fortune always rewards the prepared. And so you have to prepare yourself for the new product launch that you're intending to undertake in a given market.
Great. Given the time, I'll just ask a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the the questions from the audience. And pardon me for asking a somewhat long question, but you mentioned the gig economy, and I wanted to ask you about this. One of the most dramatic transformations that you write about is the rise of the collaborative consumption. We have seen the rise of platform-based companies like Uber and Airbnb. And in India, there are companies like Zomato and Swiggy and Ola that have become household names. And you write that owning is out and sharing is in. And by 2030, nearly half the consumption will be in the form of collaborative consumption. But I think this is a double-edged sword. It has created unicorns on the one side that are valued at billions of dollars. But on the other hand, it has also brought into being millions of gig economy workers. In fact, you quote an economist who calls them the precariat, which is a combination of precarious and proletariat. These workers earn a pittance, and they seem to be an endless digital treadmill. They are at the beck and call of algorithmic bosses who punish anyone who fails to respond. What can be done to improve the well-being of these gig economy workers? And is this worsening income inequality or making things better?
So I think this is a very important debate. And in the book, I mentioned, some of the critics of the gig economy. And I, have to say that the old model in which everybody had a job and you had certain benefits that came with the job, that worked very well for some people, but not for others. But it also created a situation in which some companies found it very hard to adjust to changes in the marketplace. So it's not that the model that presumably this gig economy is replacing was flawless and was just a success all around. So what I like about the gig economy is essentially two things. One is that it enables people to essentially have a more flexible approach to work. And as I said earlier, I think that is going to be primarily to the advantage of people above a certain age who perhaps don't want to have, a full-time job beyond a certain age, but instead of retiring, what they would like is to be able to, do something on the side so that they don't feel lonely, so that they feel engaged, so that they can make a little bit of money, which is never a bad thing. So I think we have to think about this more in terms of the life course, of the life cycle. So yes, there are certain points in our lives when we want more stability, but there are other moments in life during which what we would prefer is flexibility. And the old model was perhaps too rigid. The gig economy is perhaps too flexible. But once again, it's not that we're separating people into two different classes, and one of them is called, as you said, the precariat, right? But rather that at different stages in life, maybe people want to make a contribution to the economy in a different way. I think that's a much better approach to the problem.
I'll just end with one last question and then go to the questions from the audience. What strategies would you recommend we should adopt to deal with all these major trends that are reshaping the next decade? What can we all do?
Well, I think what we need to do is, first of all, accept the fact that things are changing. So as you know, in part because of the effect of social media, there's a lot of denial. There's a lot of fake news about what's going on out there. So I think that's the first obstacle that we need to overcome if we want to be able to adjust to all of these changes. Now, the second one, I think, is to reconsider very carefully how we make decisions. In the book, as you know, in the last chapter, I talk about 7 different principles that people may find useful in terms of coping with all of this change. And in the interest of time, let me just mention the one that I think is the most important out of those 7, although the other 6 are also quite useful. But the one that I find the most useful in my own thinking is that whenever there's so much change, it's really important to preserve an element in flexibility as you make decisions. So in other words, our instinct as human beings, when everything is changing, is either to freeze and not make any decision until the uncertainty goes away, or the other extreme, which is to change everything. So if everything is changing, then we just completely reinvent ourselves. So I'm not going to say that those 2 extreme reactions are not helpful in some cases, but I think in most situations, what really uncertainty calls for is to preserve a certain degree of flexibility. So I talk in the book about keeping your options open. In other words, don't make decisions that are irreversible. Always make an allowance for you to be in a position to pivot or to reverse course. That I think is really important. So once again, because we're going through this major transformation, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and thus we don't know exactly, what the state of the world will be in 2 years from now, in 5 years from now. And so, that I think is perhaps the most useful principle. And by the way, this reminds me, Mukul, that going back to your question at the beginning about predicting the future. Look, I think it is really hard to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen in a week from now, or even a month from now. I think it's also very hard to predict what's going to happen in 50 years from now, or 100 years from now. But I do believe that it is entirely possible to predict with a certain degree of accuracy where we're going to be in 10 years from now, which is neither a very long time horizon nor a very short one.
Great, thank you. Just a question to the organizers. Do we have time for 2 or 3 quick questions from the audience? Just wanted to check in, do a time check.
Yeah, so we do have Mukul. I think so. Session is supposed to close at 7:15, which gives us about 8 minutes. So you could time that accordingly. I think it does give us time.
Yeah, thank you, Ganesh.
Sure.
So there's a question, Mauro, from Sangeeta Prasad, who says, how do you see the environment risks shaping up, and how do you evaluate the mitigation strategies?
Yeah, so I think, Sangeeta, the question is about climate change. Is that right, Mukul?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so climate change. Look, climate change is undeniably a very important problem that we're facing. Most of the effects will be felt later than 10 years from now. But of course, we all know that unless we change our ways now, it's going to be very difficult to cope with the consequences. And unfortunately, the consequences are going to be more severe for countries that are poorer for 2 reasons. One is that they're more exposed to climate change to begin with, but also that they have fewer resources to cope with the consequences of climate change. So I think, we have 3 deficits right now in the world. We have one deficit is intergovernmental collaboration. So governments are not really talking to one another. The last 4 or 5 years have been, I think, very frustrating, because this is a global problem, and unless all important governments in the world are sitting at the table and discussing how to address it, it's going to be very difficult to overcome. The second thing is, we're all thinking, oh, maybe technology will come to the rescue. Maybe there will be a major breakthrough in energy production, and that will help us overcome or drastically reduce carbon emissions, and therefore help us with climate change. And that may be true. I think we're already seeing the fruits of some of those technological advancements in terms of, for example, both wind power and solar power being perfectly competitive in terms of cost with some of the dirtiest technologies around, such as, for example, coal. But then the third point, which is the one that I emphasize in the book, is that I don't think we're going to be able to cope with climate change without changes in our behavior. The problem, I think, the fundamental problem is that as consumers, we have become very wasteful. And I think this is particularly the case in the United States, but of course, as more and more people become middle class and therefore they consume more in China, in India, in the emerging world, we also need to pay attention to what kinds of consumers they're becoming. Are we, in other words, helping them be pro-environmental in terms of their consumption? So those are the problems that I see. And I strongly believe that we can make a lot of progress if only we were able to change the way in which we consume.
Thank you, Mauro. We have, I think, 5 minutes left, and Shankar has an interesting question. He says, you write in the book that women will command more wealth than men globally. How will that happen?
Yeah, so it is, I think, one of the most significant changes, because the consequences are going to be felt for many years to come. So in other words, women now own about half of the wealth in the world. And of course, that is driven by essentially 2 factors. One is that women's access to education has improved dramatically. We're not yet at the level of parity, but the improvement in many parts of the world over the last 20, 30, 40 years has been very impressive. That means that then women have fewer children, but also that they have a career, they have a job, they make their own money, and that's how they are accumulating wealth. But then there's another factor here. So most of the wealth in the world, as Mukul, you mentioned a few minutes ago, is in the hands of people above the age of 60.
Yeah.
And essentially then what that means is that women also are accumulating wealth faster than men, because there's more women above the age of 60 than men above the age of 60. And that's, as you know, because women's life expectancy is longer than men's by about 5 or 6 years in most of the developed world, and between 3 and 4 years in emerging markets. So it's the combination of women having better access to education, getting better jobs, getting paid, saving their money, and so on. That's one thing. And the second is the longevity of women relative to men.
Great. There's a follow-up to the response you gave to Sangeeta, which is when you say we should change our ways to deal with the climate crisis, what are you referring to? Individually and at the corporate level and as nations, are there 2 or 3 critical things we can do right away? This question comes from Pooja.
Yeah, so what we need is changes in consumer behavior. We need to, as consumers, become less wasteful. Now, how can we accomplish that? Well, certainly companies can help. For example, by selling their products in smaller containers so that we only buy exactly the amount that we need. This can be accomplished also by reducing the packaging, the weight and the scope of the packaging of products. And that's also a decision that companies could make. But more importantly, is if people like you and I, Mukul, if we change, if we don't waste, for example, as much food, if we don't buy so many clothes every year and then we forget that we have them. In other words, if we are a little bit more conscious that each time that we buy something, even if it's very cheap, there's a carbon footprint behind it.
Right.
And I think, once again, we are so wasteful that we could easily reduce the problem of climate change by at least 20 or 30% if we were able to help people change their behavior as consumers.
Great. And I think we have one last question from Benedict Permanent, who says, you've written so many best-selling books. What is the secret to writing a bestseller?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the compliment. Let me just say that as a true best-selling book, 2030 is the first. So I have written books before, but most of my previous books were written for other scholars. So they were more scholarly books rather than books intended for the general public. And therefore, they didn't sell as well, unfortunately, as 2030. I think the secret is, as an author, you need to have a story to tell, right? Mukul, you know better than I do. At the end of the day, everything is a story. Even in fields such as physics or mathematics, right? You want to tell a story. And so, as an author, it's really important that you have a story to tell. And then, if you're thinking about delivering that story in the form of a book, as opposed to an article, that you have enough material and you have enough stamina, as a writer to tell that story, not over 2 or 3 or 4 pages, but rather over 300 pages. So I think that's the secret, to come up with a good story to tell.
That's a wonderful note to end on for the Business Literature Festival in Bangalore. I can't thank you enough, Mauro, and let me encourage everyone to read the book. It is worth your investment. And Mauro, thank you once again for sharing your knowledge and insights.
Oh, thank you so much, Mukul, for inviting me.